The prairie stretched endlessly beneath a vast, cloudless sky, the tall grasses swaying gently in the warm summer breeze. The Harper family's car rolled down the dusty dirt road, leaving a plume of dust in its wake. Inside, the air buzzed with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "There it is!" Tom Harper's voice broke the silence, pointing ahead. The mansion loomed in the distance, an imposing structure that seemed out of place in the endless sea of green. It was a Victorian-era edifice, complete with turrets and gables, its weathered stone walls and boarded-up windows giving it an air of mystery and melancholy. "It's bigger than I thought," murmured Janet Harper, Tom's wife, her voice tinged with unease. She glanced at her husband, hoping to find reassurance in his eyes, but found only a reflection of her own doubts. "Mom, look at that!" Emily, their 8-year-old daughter, pressed her face against the window, eyes wide with wonder. "It looks like a castle." Tom forced a smile. "It does, doesn't it? And it's all ours now. A new beginning for the Harper family." They pulled up to the front of the mansion. The car's engine sputtered and died, leaving an eerie silence that seemed to amplify the creaking of the old house. Tom got out first, stretching his legs and taking a deep breath. The air smelled fresh, tinged with the earthy scent of the prairie. "This is it," he said, more to himself than to his family. He walked up to the massive wooden door, its surface marred by time and weather, and fumbled with the keys. Janet and Emily joined him, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Janet looked up at the towering structure, her unease growing. She had agreed to this move for Tom's sake, hoping it would be a fresh start for their strained marriage. But now, standing in front of the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a terrible mistake. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit foyer. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through the cracks in the boarded windows. The air was cool and stale, carrying the faint scent of decay. Janet shivered, rubbing her arms as they stepped inside. Emily's eyes sparkled with excitement as she ran ahead, her footsteps echoing through the cavernous hall. "Look at all the rooms! Can I pick my bedroom?" Tom chuckled. "Go ahead, sweetheart. Just be careful." Janet walked slowly, her eyes scanning the dark wood paneling, the ornate but dusty chandeliers, and the faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. The house was a relic of a bygone era, beautiful in its decay. But there was something else, a feeling that she couldn't quite put her finger on, a heaviness in the air, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting. "Tom, are you sure about this place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom turned to her, his expression softening. "I know it's a bit overwhelming, but we can make it work. It just needs some love and care. And think of the space. Emily will love it here." Janet forced a smile and nodded. "You're right. It's just going to take some getting used to." They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring their new home. Emily's laughter echoed through the empty rooms, a stark contrast to the silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Janet tried to shake off her unease, focusing on the potential the house held, the spacious kitchen, the grand staircase, the sprawling grounds outside. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie, they gathered in the living room for a makeshift picnic dinner. The room was dimly lit by the last light of day, the furniture covered in white sheets like ghosts waiting to be unveiled. "This will be nice," Tom said, taking Janet's hand in his. "We'll make it a home." Janet squeezed his hand, trying to match his optimism. "Yes, we will." But as darkness settled over the mansion, The sense of foreboding grew stronger. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the windows and making the old house creak and groan. Emily snuggled closer to her parents, her earlier excitement replaced by a hint of fear. "Daddy, do you think there are any ghosts here?" she asked, her voice small. Tom laughed, though it sounded forced. "Of course not, sweetheart. It's just an old house. Nothing to be afraid of." But as they huddled together in the encroaching darkness, none of them could shake the feeling that they were not alone. The mansion, with its long and tragic history, seemed to watch and wait, its secrets hidden in the shadows. The Harpers had come seeking a new beginning, but they had unwittingly walked into a place steeped in old sorrows and restless spirits, and the house, patient and ancient, was ready to welcome them. The first night in the mansion was restless. The creaks and groans of the old house seemed amplified in the darkness, each sound reverberating through the cavernous halls. Janet lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the strange noises that surrounded them. Tom's reassuring words did little to comfort her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Morning came with a pale, wan light filtering through the dusty windows. Janet felt a wave of relief as the house seemed less menacing in the daylight. Determined to make the best of their new home, she decided to start unpacking and organizing. Tom and Emily were already up, exploring the grounds outside. The sound of Emily's laughter echoed back into the house, bringing a smile to Janet's face. She began to tackle the boxes stacked in the foyer, humming softly to herself. As she unpacked, Janet discovered a hidden door behind one of the large bookcases in the study. It was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it seeming to beckon her. Curiosity getting the better of her, she pulled the door open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the basement. The air grew colder as she descended the steps, the light from above dimming with each step. Janet fumbled for a light switch at the bottom, eventually finding an old, rusted chain hanging from the ceiling. She gave it a firm tug, and a single bulb flickered to life, casting a dim glow over the room. The basement was vast, filled with old furniture, trunks, and an assortment of forgotten relics. As she walked deeper into the room, Janet noticed an old wooden chest in the corner, partially covered by a tattered blanket. She knelt down and brushed the dust off the lid, hesitating for a moment before opening it. Inside, she found a collection of old photographs and journals. The photographs were yellowed with age, depicting a family she assumed to be the Wilcox family, the previous owners of the mansion. Their faces were solemn, their eyes haunted by a deep sadness. Janet picked up one of the journals, its leather cover cracked and worn. She opened it, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. The entries detailed the life of Margaret Wilcox, the matriarch of the family. As Janet read, she felt a growing unease. July 15th, 1887. The children are restless again. The house seems to hum with a strange energy. I hear whispers at night, but when I investigate, there is nothing there. September 3rd, 1887. Thomas has taken ill. The doctor says it is a fever, but I fear it is something more. The air in this house feels heavy, oppressive. I do not know how much longer we can stay here. October 31st, 1887. The whispers have grown louder. Last night I saw a figure at the foot of our bed, watching us. When I tried to wake Thomas, it vanished. I fear we are not alone in this house. Janet shivered, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She placed the journal back in the chest and stood up, backing away from the relics of the past. The sense of foreboding she had felt since they moved in was now a tangible weight on her chest. She hurried back up the stairs, slamming the hidden door shut behind her. As she leaned against the bookcase, trying to steady her breathing, Tom and Emily burst into the foyer, laughing and covered in dirt. "Mom, you should see the garden. It's amazing," Emily exclaimed, her face glowing with excitement. Janet forced a smile, trying to push the unsettling discoveries from her mind. "That's great, sweetheart. We'll have to spend some time out there this weekend." Tom frowned, noticing her pale face. "You okay, John? You look like you've seen a ghost." Janet chuckled nervously. "Just found some old things in the basement. Nothing to worry about." Tom wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We'll make this place our home. It's just going to take some time." But as they stood together in the foyer, the hidden door behind the bookcase seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the secrets of the past waiting to be uncovered. And the mansion, with its long and tragic history, seemed to watch and wait, ready to reveal its horrors to the new inhabitants. The Harper family had come seeking a new beginning, but they were quickly discovering that the mansion had other plans. The spirits of the past were restless, and they would not be ignored. The next few days passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in. Janet threw herself into making the mansion feel like home, determined to dispel the unsettling feelings that clung to her. She hung up family photos, arranged furniture, and even managed to get the old kitchen stove working again. The mansion, despite its eerie aura, began to take on a semblance of warmth. Emily, however, seemed to be having a different experience. She spent most of her time exploring, her boundless curiosity leading her into every nook and cranny of the vast house. One afternoon, while Janet was preparing lunch, Emily came running into the kitchen, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mom! Mom! I found a secret room!" she exclaimed, tugging on Janet's apron. Janet turned, wiping her hands on a towel. "A secret room? Where?" "Upstairs. Come on, I'll show you." Emily led Janet up the grand staircase, her small feet pattering excitedly on the wooden steps. They went down a long, dimly lit hallway lined with closed doors, the floorboards creaking beneath their weight. At the end of the hallway, Emily stopped in front of an old, ornate mirror. "It's behind here," she whispered, a mischievous glint in her eyes. She pushed the mirror aside to reveal a narrow door, its paint chipped and faded. "See?" Janet's curiosity piqued. "How did you find this?" Emily shrugged. "I just felt like something was here, so I looked." They pushed the door open, revealing a small, dusty room. The air inside was cool and stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Janet stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was filled with old toys, books, and a small wooden bed covered in a faded quilt. "It looks like a child's room," Janet murmured, feeling a chill run down her spine. Emily wandered over to the bed, picking up a worn stuffed bear. "Do you think a little girl lived here?" "Maybe," Janet replied, her mind racing. She noticed an old, leather-bound diary on a small desk by the window. Opening it, she saw that it belonged to a girl named Abigail Wilcox. The entries were filled with drawings and short notes, the handwriting growing more erratic as the pages progressed. June 12th, 1887. "Today, I played in the garden. The flowers are blooming, and Mama says they are the prettiest she has ever seen." August 4th, 1887. "The voices in the walls are getting louder. Mama says it's just the wind, but I know it's something else." October 28th, 1887. I saw her again last night, the girl in the white dress. She stands by my bed and watches me. I told Mama, but she says it's just a dream. Janet closed the diary, her hands trembling. "Emily, we should go. It's getting late." Emily nodded, sensing her mother's discomfort. As they left the room, Janet replaced the mirror, hoping to hide the secret room from Tom. She didn't want to worry him with tales of ghostly encounters and haunted histories. That night, as the house settled into silence, Emily lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind buzzed with thoughts of Abigail Wilcox and the girl in the white dress. She felt a strange connection to the forgotten child, as if their lives were somehow intertwined. Around midnight, Emily awoke with a start. The room was cold and the moonlight cast eerie shadows on the walls. She heard a faint whisper, so soft she thought she might be dreaming. "Emily." The voice was faint, but unmistakable. She sat up, her heart pounding, and looked around. In the corner of her room stood a figure, barely visible in the darkness. A young girl in a white dress, her face obscured by shadows. "Who are you?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but Emily felt an overwhelming sadness emanating from it. She wanted to reach out to help, but fear rooted her in place. "Please, help me," the voice whispered again, before fading away. Emily blinked and the figure was gone. The room was silent once more, but the chill remained. She pulled the covers up to her chin, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night, her mind replaying the encounter over and over. The next morning, Emily was quiet at breakfast, her eyes ringed with dark circles. Janet noticed immediately, her motherly instincts kicking in. "Emily, are you feeling okay?" she asked, concern etched on her face. Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "I saw her, Mom. The girl in the white dress." Janet's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "She was in my room last night. She asked for help." Tom looked up from his newspaper, frowning. "Emily, it was probably just a bad dream." But Emily shook her head vigorously. "No, it was real. She was real." Janet exchanged a worried glance with Tom. "Maybe we should talk to someone about this. Someone who knows about the house." Tom sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right, we'll look into it. But let's not jump to conclusions." As the day wore on, Janet couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. The mansion, with its hidden rooms and tragic past, was revealing its secrets one by one. And the Harper family was slowly becoming entwined in its dark history. The spirits of the past were restless, and they were making their presence known. Janet's determination to uncover the mansion's history intensified. She spent hours at the local library, poring over old newspapers and records, trying to piece together the tragic story of the Wilcox family. Her mind buzzed with questions. Who was the girl in the white dress? What had happened to the Wilcoxes? And why were they haunting the mansion? It was a gray, overcast afternoon when she finally found what she was looking for. An old newspaper article dated November 1st, 1887, detailed the horrific events that had transpired at the mansion. On the night of October 31st, 1887, the Wilcox family met a tragic and mysterious end. Thomas Wilcox, his wife Margaret, and their two children, Abigail and James, were found dead in their home. The cause of death remains unclear, but neighbors reported hearing screams and seeing strange lights coming from the house that night. The mansion has remained uninhabited since, its halls echoing with the sorrow of the past. Janet sat back, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had read. The mansion was a place of deep sorrow and unresolved anguish. She realized that the spirits were not just haunting them. They were reaching out, desperate for someone to understand their pain. Determined to find more answers, Janet returned home. She needed to share what she had discovered with Tom and figure out how to help the restless spirits. As she walked through the door, she was greeted by the sound of Emily's laughter coming from the living room. "Mom, you're home!" Emily ran up to her, hugging her tightly. Janet smiled, ruffling her daughter's hair. "Hey, sweetie, where's Dad?" "He's in the study. I think he's trying to fix that old clock." Janet nodded and headed towards the study. She found Tom hunched over the antique grandfather clock, its inner workings spread out on the desk. "Tom, we need to talk," she said, her voice serious. Tom looked up, concern in his eyes. "What's wrong?" Janet took a deep breath and recounted everything she had learned at the library. Tom listened intently, his frown deepening with each detail. "So, the Wilcox family? They all died here?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes, and it seems like their spirits are still here trying to reach out to us," Janet replied, her voice trembling. "I think we need to help them find peace." Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "But how? We're not exactly ghost hunters." "I don't know," Janet admitted. "But I think we need to try. Maybe we can find someone who knows more about this kind of thing." Their conversation was interrupted by a loud crash from upstairs. They both jumped, their eyes meeting in alarm. "That came from Emily's room," Tom said, already moving towards the door. They raced up the stairs, their hearts pounding. Emily's room was a mess, her toys scattered across the floor. But what caught Janet's attention was the old mirror from the secret room, now cracked and lying face down on the floor. Emily stood in the middle of the room, her face pale. "I didn't do it, Mom. I swear, it just fell." Janet hugged her daughter tightly, trying to calm her racing heart. "It's okay, sweetie. It's not your fault." As Tom picked up the mirror, Janet noticed something written on the back of it, hidden beneath the dust and grime. She leaned in closer, her eyes widening as she read the words carved into the wood. "Help us." That night, as the wind howled outside and the house creaked and groaned, Janet lay awake, her mind racing. She knew they needed to find someone who could help them communicate with the spirits. Someone who could help them unravel the full story of the Wilcox family and find a way to bring them peace. The next morning, Janet made some calls. She found a local historian, Mrs. Dolores Thompson, who had a reputation for knowing the darkest secrets of the town's history. They arranged to meet at the mansion later that week. When Mrs. Thompson arrived, she was a small, wiry woman with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. She carried an air of authority and knowledge, her presence commanding attention. "I understand you've been having some trouble with the spirits in this house," she said, her voice calm and measured. Janet nodded, leading her to the study where they had laid out all the information they had gathered. Mrs. Thompson examined the documents, her expression unreadable. "The Wilcox family suffered greatly here. Their deaths were tragic, and it seems their spirits are unable to move on. But there is more to this story, something darker." "What do you mean?" Tom asked, his voice tense. Mrs. Thompson looked up, her eyes serious. "There are rumors, old tales about this land, stories of dark rituals and ancient curses. I believe the Wilcox family may have been victims of something far more sinister than we initially thought." Janet felt a chill run down her spine. "What can we do to help them?" "We need to perform a cleansing ritual, one that will help release their spirits from this place," Mrs. Thompson replied. "But it will not be easy. The spirits are strong, and the darkness here is deep." As they prepared for the ritual, the sense of foreboding grew stronger. The mansion seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, its walls whispering secrets of the past. The Harpers and Mrs. Thompson stood together in the dim light of the study, their resolve tested but unbroken. The spirits of the past were restless, but the Harpers were determined to help them find peace. The mansion's dark history was slowly unraveling, and they were ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. The air inside the mansion grew heavy and oppressive as the days passed. Janet, Tom, and Emily became acutely aware of the ever-present sense of being watched. The mansion's atmosphere shifted from merely eerie to something far more sinister, and it wasn't long before the unsettling incidents escalated. One night, Tom awoke to the sound of soft sobbing. He sat up, straining to locate the source of the mournful cries. They seemed to be coming from the hallway. Cautiously, he slipped out of bed and crept towards the sound. As he reached the top of the stairs, the sobbing abruptly stopped. The hallway was empty, but the air was frigid, each breath clouding before him. He shivered and rubbed his arms, feeling a prickling sensation at the nape of his neck. Just as he was about to turn back, a cold hand brushed against his shoulder. He spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Yet the sense of being touched lingered, a ghostly imprint on his skin. Trembling, he hurried back to bed, trying to rationalize the encounter as a trick of his sleep-deprived mind. The following morning, Tom shared his experience with Janet. She listened, her face pale and drawn. "It's getting worse, Tom. We need to do something." "We will. Mrs. Thompson is coming back today to help us with the ritual," Tom replied, trying to reassure her. "We'll get through this." As they prepared for Mrs. Thompson's arrival, Emily wandered into the garden, seeking solace among the flowers. The garden had become her refuge, a place where the weight of the house's dark history seemed to lift. She sat by the old oak tree, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. Suddenly, a cold breeze rustled the leaves, and Emily felt a presence behind her. She turned slowly, her eyes widening as she saw the figure of the girl in the white dress standing at the edge of the garden, her face obscured by shadows. "Why are you here?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. The girl's form flickered, her eyes sad and hollow. "We are trapped. Help us." Emily felt a surge of sympathy and fear. "How can I help you?" Before the girl could answer, a loud crash echoed from the house. Emily jumped up and ran inside, her heart racing. She found Janet and Tom in the living room, staring at a shattered mirror on the floor. "Emily, are you okay?" Janet asked, her voice shaking. "I saw her again, Mom. The girl in the white dress. She said they're trapped and need our help." Janet and Tom exchanged worried glances. The urgency of their situation was becoming undeniable. When Mrs. Thompson arrived later that day, the tension in the house was palpable. "We need to begin the ritual as soon as possible," Mrs. Thompson said, her tone grave. "The spirits are growing more desperate, and their presence is becoming more aggressive." They gathered in the basement, where the air was thick with anticipation. Mrs. Thompson set up candles and laid out a series of old, leather-bound books. She instructed Janet, Tom, and Emily to hold hands, forming a circle around a small table. As Mrs. Thompson began to chant in a language none of them understood, the temperature in the room plummeted. The candle flames flickered and danced, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The oppressive feeling intensified, and Janet felt a cold hand grip her own, though she knew it wasn't Tom's or Emily's. The chanting grew louder, filling the room with a haunting melody. The spirits of the Wilcox family began to manifest, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of sight. Abigail, the girl in the white dress, stood at the center of the circle, her eyes pleading. "Help us. Free us," she whispered, her voice echoing in the basement. Mrs. Thompson's chanting reached a crescendo, and the room shook with a violent tremor. The candles were extinguished, plunging them into darkness. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by their ragged breaths. Then, a low, guttural growl emanated from the shadows. The air grew thick with malevolence, and Janet felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The ritual had disturbed something far darker than they had anticipated. A shadowy figure loomed in the corner, its presence exuding pure hatred. Mrs. Thompson's voice wavered as she continued to chant, trying to banish the dark entity, but the shadow seemed to grow stronger, feeding off their fear. "Get out of here!" Mrs. Thompson shouted. "Run!" Tom grabbed Janet's hand, pulling her and Emily towards the stairs. They scrambled up, the shadowy figure pursuing them with an unearthly speed. As they reached the top, the basement door slammed shut behind them, sealing the darkness below. They collapsed in the living room, gasping for breath. The house seemed to settle, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. But the threat was far from over. "We need to finish the ritual," Mrs. Thompson said, her face pale and drawn. "The dark entity we disturbed is more powerful than I thought. We must find a way to banish it, or it will consume us all." The Harpers nodded, their resolve hardening. They had come to the mansion seeking a new beginning, but they had found themselves entangled in a battle between the living and the dead. The spirits were growing more desperate, and the dark force they had awakened threatened to destroy them. The mansion's history was unraveling, and they were caught in its deadly grasp. The escalation of the supernatural activity was only the beginning of their nightmare, and the Harpers knew they had to find a way to survive the horrors that lay ahead. The mansion was a maelstrom of spectral activity. The walls seemed to hum with energy, and strange occurrences became a daily torment for the Harper family. Janet, Tom, and Emily could no longer deny the presence of the spirits, and their desperation grew with each passing day. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, the lights flickered and the temperature in the room plummeted. The chandelier above the dining table began to sway, its crystal pendants chiming like an eerie melody. Emily clutched her fork, her eyes wide with fear. "Mom, it's happening again." Before Janet could respond, the chandelier suddenly dropped, crashing onto the table with a deafening roar. Plates and glasses shattered, sending shards flying in all directions. The Harpers scrambled back, their hearts pounding. Tom pulled Emily into his arms, his voice shaking. "Everyone stay close. We need to get out of here." But as they moved toward the door, it slammed shut, trapping them inside. The room filled with whispers, a cacophony of voices speaking in hushed tones, their words indecipherable, but full of sorrow and anger. Janet felt a cold breeze brush past her, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw Abigail's ghostly figure standing by the window, her eyes pleading. "Help us! Free us!" Tom banged on the door, trying to force it open. "Janet, do something!" Janet, thinking quickly, grabbed the silver candlestick from the sideboard and swung it at the door's glass panel. The glass shattered, and Tom reached through to unlock the door from the outside. They stumbled into the hallway, the whispers growing louder behind them. In the chaos, they found Mrs. Thompson in the library, poring over ancient texts and manuscripts. She looked up, her face grim. "It's worse than I feared. The spirits are becoming more aggressive. We need to finish the ritual before it's too late." As they regrouped, the air around them seemed to thicken, a palpable sense of dread seeping into every corner of the mansion. The spirits of the Wilcox family were no longer just haunting the Harpers. They were actively seeking their attention, their manifestations growing increasingly violent. One night, as Janet lay in bed, she heard soft footsteps outside her door. She sat up, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, and a cold draft swept into the room. Janet held her breath, her eyes fixed on the door. The handle turned slowly and the door creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, a woman in a long, tattered dress, her face obscured by a veil. Janet's heart raced as the figure glided into the room, its movements ethereal and otherworldly. "Margaret Wilcox," Janet whispered, her voice trembling. The figure paused, lifting the veil to reveal a face twisted with sorrow and anguish. "You must help us. He will not let us go." "Who? Who won't let you go?" Janet asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Before Margaret could answer, the room was filled with a guttural growl. The dark entity had returned, its presence suffocating. Margaret's ghostly form flickered and disappeared, leaving Janet alone with the oppressive darkness. The entity loomed over her, its eyes burning with malevolence. Janet felt a cold hand wrap around her throat, squeezing the air from her lungs. She struggled, her vision darkening, when suddenly the grip loosened and the entity vanished. Gasping for breath, Janet stumbled out of her room and into the hallway, where she found Tom and Emily huddled together, their faces pale with fear. "We can't stay here," Tom said, his voice resolute. "This house is trying to kill us." "But we can't just leave," Janet replied, her voice wavering. "We need to help the Wilcox family. We need to finish the ritual." Reluctantly, Tom nodded. "All right, but we need to be careful. This thing, whatever it is, it's getting stronger." They sought out Mrs. Thompson, who was already preparing for the final stages of the ritual. She laid out the necessary items: candles, incense, and an ancient tome filled with incantations. "The dark entity you've encountered is an ancient evil, bound to this land long before the Wilcox family lived here," Mrs. Thompson explained. "It feeds on fear and sorrow, and it has trapped the Wilcox spirits here to perpetuate its own existence. We need to perform the final ritual in the heart of the house," Mrs. Thompson continued, "the place where the darkness is strongest." Together they made their way to the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and the sense of malevolence intensified. They reached the bottom, and Mrs. Thompson began setting up the ritual circle, her hands steady despite the palpable fear in the room. As the ritual commenced, the spirits of the Wilcox family appeared, their ghostly forms watching with desperate hope. The dark entity loomed in the shadows, its presence a constant threat. Mrs. Thompson's chanting grew louder, and the candles flickered wildly. The entity surged forward, its form a swirling mass of darkness and hatred. Janet, Tom, and Emily held hands, forming a circle around Mrs. Thompson, their collective will focused on banishing the evil presence. The room shook violently, and the air filled with an unearthly howl. The entity fought against the ritual, its anger and desperation palpable. But Mrs. Thompson's voice remained steady, her incantations growing in strength. With a final deafening roar, the dark entity was pulled into the center of the circle, its form dissolving into nothingness. The air cleared and the oppressive weight lifted. The spirits of the Wilcox family stood before them, their forms now peaceful and serene. Abigail stepped forward, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you. We are free." As the spirits faded, Janet felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. The mansion, once a place of darkness and despair, was now still and quiet. But the battle was not yet over. They had freed the Wilcox family, but the true test lay ahead. The final confrontation with the dark force awaited, and the Harpers knew they had to be prepared for whatever horrors the mansion had in store. The ghosts had made their presence known, but the darkness that had plagued the mansion for centuries was far from defeated. The Harpers stood together, their resolve unbroken, ready to face the ultimate challenge that lay ahead. The Harpers spent the next few days recovering from their ordeal. The mansion was quieter, but the sense of unease lingered. The spirits of the Wilcox family might have found peace, but the darkness that had plagued the house was far from vanquished. Janet knew they needed to uncover the mansion's full history to understand the malevolent force still residing within its walls. Janet returned to the library, combing through more records and documents. She found a local historian who had written extensively about the town's past, including its darker chapters. Armed with this new information, Janet hoped to piece together the remaining fragments of the mansion's story. One rainy afternoon, she sat at the kitchen table, her notes spread out before her. Emily was drawing quietly, her eyes occasionally darting to the shadows that seemed to move on their own. Tom was in the study, fixing the old grandfather clock that had stopped working during the last seance. Janet's eyes scanned an old manuscript, her heart skipping a beat as she read a passage about the mansion's origins. The mansion, built in the early 1800s by a wealthy landowner named Samuel Harrington, was rumored to be cursed from the start. Harrington, known for his ruthless business practices, allegedly dabbled in dark rituals to amass his wealth. The land on which the mansion stood was considered sacred by the local Native American tribes, and Harrington's desecration of their burial grounds was said to have invoked a powerful curse. Janet's eyes widened as she continued reading. The manuscript detailed how Harrington's family met a series of tragic ends, much like the Wilcox family. Each generation faced untimely deaths, fueling the mansion's dark reputation. In 1887, the mansion was purchased by Thomas Wilcox, a successful businessman looking for a fresh start. Unaware of the mansion's dark history, Wilcox and his family soon fell victim to the curse. The malevolent force that haunted the mansion was believed to be the vengeful spirit of Samuel Harrington, bound to the land he had desecrated. Janet's mind raced. The dark entity they had encountered wasn't just any spirit. It was the twisted soul of Samuel Harrington, feeding on the misery and fear of those who dared to live in his mansion. The curse was deeply rooted, tied to the very land on which the mansion stood. That evening, Janet gathered Tom and Emily in the living room, sharing her findings. Tom listened intently, his face growing graver with each revelation. "So Harrington's spirit is what's haunting us? And it's been doing this for generations?" Tom asked, his voice tense. Janet nodded. "Yes, and we need to find a way to break the curse that binds him to this place. If we don't, he'll keep tormenting anyone who lives here." Emily looked up from her drawing, her eyes wide. "But how do we do that, Mom?" "We need to perform a final ritual to cleanse the land and banish Harrington's spirit for good," Janet replied. "Mrs. Thompson mentioned something about a dangerous ritual. I think this is what she meant." They decided to contact Mrs. Thompson once more, explaining what they had uncovered. She agreed to help them prepare for the final confrontation with Harrington's spirit. On the night of the ritual, a heavy storm raged outside, the wind howling like a chorus of lost souls. The Harpers and Mrs. Thompson gathered in the living room, the air thick with tension. "We need to perform the ritual in the basement," Mrs. Thompson instructed. "That's where Harrington's spirit is strongest. We'll need to summon him and then break the curse that binds him here." As they descended into the basement, the temperature dropped and the oppressive feeling returned. The room was filled with shadows, and the candlelight flickered wildly. They formed a circle, holding hands as Mrs. Thompson began to chant. The air grew heavy, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The dark entity, Samuel Harrington's vengeful spirit, began to manifest, his form a swirling mass of darkness and rage. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and his voice echoed through the room. "You dare to challenge me? You will suffer as they did." The Harpers stood their ground, their fear replaced by determination. Mrs. Thompson's chanting grew louder, the words reverberating with power. The shadows writhed and twisted, the air crackling with energy. "Samuel Harrington," Mrs. Thompson intoned, "you are bound to this land by your own dark deeds. We summon you to face your judgment and release the souls you have tormented." The entity roared, its form shifting and contorting. The room shook, and the candles were extinguished, plunging them into darkness. But the circle held, their collective will focused on breaking the curse. Janet felt a surge of energy course through her, and she joined Mrs. Thompson in the chant. Tom and Emily followed suit, their voices merging into a powerful incantation. The darkness around them began to recede, the oppressive weight lifting. With a final ear-piercing scream, Harrington's spirit was pulled into the center of the circle, his form dissolving into nothingness. The room fell silent, the air clear and still. The curse was broken. The Harpers and Mrs. Thompson stood in the basement, their bodies trembling with relief and exhaustion. The mansion, once a place of darkness and despair, was now eerily calm. "Is it over?" Emily asked, her voice small and hopeful. Mrs. Thompson nodded, a weary smile on her face. "Yes, it's over. The curse is lifted, and Harrington's spirit is gone. You're safe now." As they made their way back upstairs, the sense of peace was palpable. The mansion, once a prison for tormented souls, was now just a house, a home waiting to be filled with new memories. The Harpers had faced the horrors of the past and emerged victorious. The haunting was revealed, and the darkness that had plagued the mansion for generations was finally defeated. But as they settled into their new life, the Harpers knew that the scars of their ordeal would take time to heal. They had unraveled the mansion's dark history and freed the spirits trapped within its walls. Now, they could begin to build the new beginning they had sought, their bond stronger than ever before. The peace that followed the ritual was short-lived. Despite Mrs. Thompson's assurances, the Harpers continued to experience unsettling phenomena. It seemed that while Samuel Harrington's spirit had been banished, the dark energy he had unleashed was still embedded in the mansion's very foundations. One evening, as Janet was preparing dinner, the kitchen lights flickered, and the temperature dropped sharply. She shivered, feeling the familiar chill of a ghostly presence. The knife she was using slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. She bent to pick it up and saw, out of the corner of her eye, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. "Tom?" she called out, but there was no response. When she looked again, the figure was gone. She rushed into the living room where Tom and Emily were playing a board game. "Did either of you see that?" Tom looked up, concerned. "See what?" "There was someone in the kitchen. A shadow," Janet said, her voice trembling. Tom stood, his face hardening with resolve. "This has to stop. We can't live like this." They called Mrs. Thompson, who arrived at the mansion that night with a somber expression. "I feared this might happen," she said. "The dark energy in this house is deeply rooted. We need to perform a cleansing ritual to purge it completely." The ritual Mrs. Thompson proposed was far more dangerous than anything they had attempted before. It involved summoning all the remaining spirits tied to the mansion and forcing them to move on. The risk was that the dark energy could lash out violently, endangering everyone involved. "We have no other choice," Janet said, her voice steady despite her fear. "We need to do this for Emily, for our family." They spent the next day preparing, gathering the necessary materials and fortifying their resolve. Mrs. Thompson instructed them on the incantations they would need to recite and the protective circle they would need to form. As night fell, the mansion seemed to pulse with an almost palpable dread. The Harpers and Mrs. Thompson gathered in the foyer, the center of the house's dark energy. They arranged candles in a circle and placed protective talismans at each point. "Remember," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice firm, "we must not break the circle no matter what happens. Stay strong, and we will get through this." They joined hands, forming a circle, and began to chant. The air grew heavy, and the temperature plummeted. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. As the incantation grew louder, the dark energy in the mansion began to manifest. Spectral figures appeared around them, their faces twisted with anguish. The Harpers recognized the Wilcox family among them, but there were others, spirits of those who had suffered and died on the cursed land over the centuries. The dark energy swirled around them, a malevolent force that seemed to feed on their fear. The house shook, and a low, rumbling growl filled the air. Janet tightened her grip on Tom and Emily's hands, her heart pounding. "Hold the circle!" Mrs. Thompson shouted over the noise. "Do not let go!" The dark energy condensed into a shadowy figure, larger and more terrifying than anything they had seen before. Its eyes glowed with a sinister light, and its form shifted and writhed, a manifestation of pure evil. "You will not banish me!" the entity roared, its voice shaking the walls. "We have to stay strong," Janet whispered, her voice trembling but determined. The entity surged toward them, but the protective circle held. Mrs. Thompson's chanting reached a crescendo, and the candles flared brightly, their light piercing the darkness. With a final deafening scream, the entity was forced back, its form dissolving into nothingness. The room fell silent, and the oppressive weight lifted. The spectral figures around them began to fade, their expressions peaceful. "It's done," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice weary. "The dark energy is gone. The house is cleansed." The Harpers collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. The mansion was finally at peace, its dark history purged. The next morning, as the sun rose over the prairie, the Harpers emerged from the mansion, feeling a sense of freedom they hadn't experienced since they arrived. The air was fresh, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted entirely. They stood together, looking back at the mansion that had once been a place of horror, but was now just a house with a new beginning. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," Janet said, her voice filled with gratitude. "We couldn't have done this without you." Mrs. Thompson smiled, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "You have a strong family, Janet. You faced your fears and overcame them. The house is yours now, free from its dark past." As the Harpers began to rebuild their lives, they felt a renewed sense of hope. The mansion, once a prison of torment and despair, had become a symbol of their strength and resilience. They had faced the ultimate challenge and emerged victorious, ready to create new memories in their home on the prairie. But the journey wasn't over. There were still lingering questions, and the scars of their ordeal would take time to heal. Yet they knew that together, they could face anything. The Harpers had not only survived the horrors of the mansion, they had triumphed over them. And as they stood in the light of the new day, they knew that they were ready for whatever the future held. The calm after the storm proved deceptive. The Harpers found temporary solace in their cleansed home, but the darkness had not been entirely vanquished. It lingered in the corners of the mansion, waiting for an opportunity to reassert its malevolent presence. A week after the cleansing ritual, The Harpers awoke to a house filled with an eerie silence. The usual creaks and groans were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness that set their nerves on edge. Emily was the first to sense it. She came to breakfast with dark circles under her eyes, having had nightmares of shadowy figures whispering her name. "Mom, I don't think it's over," Emily said quietly, her voice trembling. Janet exchanged a worried glance with Tom. They had hoped the ritual had been the end, but it seemed the mansion had other plans. Janet reached out to Mrs. Thompson, who agreed to come back that evening. As they waited, the oppressive atmosphere grew more intense. Objects moved on their own, whispers filled the halls, and dark shadows flickered at the edge of their vision. Janet felt a familiar chill, the same cold dread that had haunted them since they first moved in. Mrs. Thompson arrived at dusk, her face etched with concern. "I feared this might happen. The ritual weakened the dark energy, but it's not completely gone. We need to perform one final ritual to banish it for good." They gathered in the living room, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil within the house. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and thunder rumbled ominously. Mrs. Thompson set up candles and protective talismans, her movements swift and deliberate. "This ritual will be the most dangerous yet," she warned. "We'll be confronting the heart of the darkness directly. Stay within the circle and do not break the chain, no matter what happens." They joined hands, forming a circle around Mrs. Thompson. The air grew cold, and the shadows deepened. Mrs. Thompson began to chant, her voice resonating with power. The candles flickered, their flames casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The darkness in the mansion coalesced into a tangible form, a swirling mass of malevolence and hatred. The entity that had plagued them, the vengeful spirit of Samuel Harrington, manifested once more, its eyes glowing with sinister intent. "You cannot defeat me," the entity hissed, its voice a blend of countless whispers. "This house and its land are mine. You will suffer, as they did." "We won't let you control us," Janet said, her voice firm despite the fear that gripped her heart. "We will free this house from your curse." Mrs. Thompson's chanting grew louder, the words reverberating through the room. The entity roared, its form shifting and writhing as it tried to break free of the ritual's power. The Harpers tightened their grip on each other's hands, their collective strength forming a barrier against the dark force. The room shook, and the air crackled with energy. The candles flared brightly, their light piercing the darkness. The entity's form began to waver, its strength diminishing as the ritual took hold. "Now," Mrs. Thompson shouted, "focus all your will on banishing the darkness. Push it out with everything you have." The Harpers concentrated, their thoughts united in a single purpose. The entity shrieked, its voice a cacophony of rage and despair. The room trembled violently, the walls groaning under the strain. With a final deafening roar, the entity was pulled into the center of the circle, its form dissolving into nothingness. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air cleared. The mansion, once a place of darkness and despair, was now silent and still. The Harpers collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. The candles burned steadily, their flames a testament to the victory they had achieved. "It's over," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. "The dark energy is gone. The mansion is finally free." The Harpers stood together, their bond stronger than ever. The mansion, once a prison of torment and fear, had been cleansed of its dark past. They had faced the ultimate challenge and emerged victorious, ready to build a new future in their home on the prairie. As they walked outside, the storm had cleared, leaving a sky filled with stars. The air was fresh, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted entirely. The Harpers looked back at the mansion, now a symbol of their strength and resilience. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," Janet said, her voice filled with gratitude. "We couldn't have done this without you." Mrs. Thompson smiled, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "You have a strong family, Janet. You faced your fears and overcame them. The house is yours now, free from its dark past." As the Harpers began to rebuild their lives, they felt a renewed sense of hope. The mansion, once a place of darkness and despair, had become a symbol of their strength and resilience. They had faced the ultimate challenge and emerged victorious, ready to create new memories in their home on the prairie. But the journey wasn't over. There were still lingering questions, and the scars of their ordeal would take time to heal. Yet they knew that together, they could face anything. The Harpers had not only survived the horrors of the mansion, they had triumphed over them. And as they stood in the light of the new day, they knew that they were ready for whatever the future held.